The shouting started high above the temple courts, a voice cutting across the buzz of money changers, lamb sellers, and sandals on stone. People looked up toward the parapet where the white limestone met the sky. A thin figure in a simple robe stood near the edge, wind tugging the hem, hands lifted not like a showman, but like a man giving testimony. His name was James, the brother of Jesus, and everyone in the city knew him. Some called him the Just. Some said his knees were calloused like a camel's from hours spent on the pavement of the inner court. He spoke plainly, the way a carpenter measures a board. No flourish, no fear. The officials who had led him up there expected submission. He spoke instead about the crucified one he called Lord, risen and alive, the judge and the hope of Israel. At first it felt like one more dispute in a city that lived on arguments. Then the crowd gathered too quickly. Priests' assistants and scribes pressed toward the base of the wall. A knot of temple guards moved as if to clear a path and then stopped, waiting for an order that hadn't come or had been given without words. The officials on the platform pushed closer. They had dragged James to this high place to force him to correct the rumors, to stop the growth that had surprised them all. Pilgrims whispering that the fishermen's friends were filling the synagogues, that widows ate because the assembly fed them, that the name of Jesus was spoken in Sabbath lessons by people who didn't stutter over it anymore. They wanted James to caution the crowd. He lifted his voice and went the other way. Those nearest the parapet shouted that his words were treachery. The lines are thin when power feels cornered. A shoulder met his back. Stone dust rose. James staggered and vanished from the line of the wall like a lamp blown out. He struck the pavement below with a sound that stopped conversation for 20 paces. Not dead. Not yet. He tried to gather himself onto elbows and knees, the same knees that had spent seasons pressed to stone in prayer. For one long second, the whole court hung between mercy and murder. The officials chose speed. A cry went up. "He has blasphemed," and stones began to fly. Some came from rage, some from fear, some from the obedience of men who have learned that the safest place in any storm is with the throwers. Guards moved to hold back the curious and the horrified, and then failed to separate either from the crowd that wanted to help. A few of James's followers pushed through, palms open, voices begging that the law not be used to settle what the law could not prove. James turned his face toward the sky and whispered a prayer for the men who were striking him. A fuller, the kind of tradesman who beats garments white on stones by the pool, stepped forward with the wooden club he used for his work. He swung once, the crowd surged and then fell quiet in the way a crowd does when the outcome becomes obvious. Word ran down the city's spine faster than a messenger could carry it. Stalls closed early. A mother tugged her child away from the court and told him not to look back. A Roman watch detail on the corner of the fortress measured the commotion and decided it was local, not imperial. They watched, hands on the cold iron of their weapons, and did nothing. The leaders who had driven the day tried to tidy it with official language. Some emphasized the fall from the parapet, as if gravity had done the work and any stones afterward were incidental. Others, more disciplined, convened a quick hearing to say the Sanhedrin had acted within its rights against a lawbreaker. The record would later read two ways, depending on who held the pen. One account spoke of a rushed stoning when authority was in flux. Another spoke of a man pushed to his death and finished with a club. The bones told a single story. The city, with its thousands of eyes, kept the rest. James's friends lifted his body and carried it through streets where market trash mingled with petals from the previous festival. They stopped at the corner where a blind beggar usually sat and found him gone, frightened away by the noise. They washed blood and dust with water pulled in jars from a public cistern. Women unfolded linen they had saved for burials and wrapped him the way mothers wrap children, layer by layer, smoothing creases as if care could still matter. A fisherman with scarred hands wept without sound. A man who had once been a zealot clenched and unclenched his jaw like a soldier trying not to reach for a sword he no longer wore. In the homes of believers that night, lamps burned late. They talked about leaving the city for a while. They talked about staying because flight felt like betrayal. They argued about risk the way families do when the door bolt suddenly sounds thin. Some had seen James settle disputes between Greek-speaking widows and Hebrew-speaking neighbors with a fairness that felt like a clean scale. Some had taken bread from his hand when their own cupboards were empty. They asked themselves the questions people ask when violence changes the map. If they killed him, what will stop them from killing us? If we keep speaking, will the streets run out of safe corners? If we fall silent, what do we become? Across town, the council's elders counted their decision a defensive win. The city had been bending. The followers of the crucified one continued to gather at Solomon's portico and in private rooms, singing the psalms and breaking bread with a gratitude that had begun to look, to nervous eyes, like recruitment. James's presence had made their movement harder to dismiss. He was not a hothead, not a foreigner, not a man easily filed under fanatic. He was a son of the city and kin to the carpenter who had stirred it. Respectable people had liked him even if they distrusted his message. That respect was the dangerous part. Remove the man, the elders told themselves, and the crowd would drift back to the habits that kept civic peace. The next mornings said otherwise. People gathered in the market and spoke James's name as if a boundary had been crossed. An almond seller remembered how he gave his own cloak to a bare-shouldered pilgrim once, then returned to folding paper cones without speaking. A butcher set his knife down and stared at the doorway for a long minute, pictured the parapet, and picked the knife up again. A young man with ink-stained fingers asked his rabbi whether the law was a tool for holiness or a rope for choking opponents. The rabbi answered carefully, because he knew the difference between a sincere question and a test laid like a snare. Within the assembly, leadership settled with a shock, like cargo shifting inside a wagon. Men who had deferred to James found their voices. They wrote letters to congregations far off, words that bent around grief and pointed stubbornly toward hope. They described Jesus as the one James had refused to deny even when the ground came up to meet him. They carried those letters by road and by coastal barge. House meetings in the city grew, then shrank as pressure squeezed them, then grew again because faith does that in the strange arithmetic of courage and fear. Widows continued to eat because their neighbors made sure they did. Orphans learned names for the people who tucked them in that didn't match blood. The story traveled out past the walls, then beyond the land, settling into communities that would recite it during meals and funerals and in the kind of prison cells that grow out of such seasons. Time gave the event layers. Some told their children that James had been tried and stoned in the formal way, because that version felt more legal, less like a mob. Others told it with the parapet and the Fuller's Club, because those details clung to their tongues and would not be smoothed away. A historian from a priestly family recorded that the high priest had acted without proper authority while the governor was absent and that it had divided the city. Another writer, passing along witness stories, wrote that James prayed for his attackers as a workers' club silenced him. The accounts collided and then held together at the points that mattered least to politics and most to people. A good man spoke about Jesus in the plain light, was shoved from a holy height, and met his end with prayer on his lips. Years down the road, when the city itself would be broken and its great stones pushed off their foundations, believers would say James's death had been a hinge. Without him, the assembly had learned to endure without the shelter of his reputation. With him gone, they had stopped hoping their respectability could buy them safety. After him, they held their meetings with the doors watched and their hearts steady. When they told the story to new faces, They did not embellish the villainy of his killers. They told the older, harder truth. Power hates to lose its hearing, and James had been a voice the city could not easily ignore. If you walk the Temple Mount in your mind, you can still draw the route in the dust with a fingertip, the top where the wind runs, the edge where his sandals slid, the courtyard flagstones, the place where a fuller might have swung because work tools are what men have at hand. The rest is not for maps. It is for the kind of memory that keeps families together and movements honest. James the Just, brother of Jesus, fell among his own, spoke mercy with his last breath, and left behind a community that understood that mercy is not weakness when it costs you everything. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.